Barnaby Fitzwilliam. His fingers trailed across cool, ashen moths forming his face despite defying physical laws. They didn't land. They for the texture of his skin, 1,000 tiny wings brushing the hollows of his cheekbones, whispering fud and tick-tick against his nerves. The silence here was absolute. A physical weight pressing down where the seagulls should have shrieked, where the ocean's rhythm should have pulsed. Only the low frequency thrummed inside my skull, a subsonic heartbeat pulling me deeper into the resort's rotting core. My breath fogged in the unnatural stillness, the air thick with the smell of salt and damp decay, the burnt sienna of peeling paint on the facade, the faded ochre of the once grand entrance. The photograph in my hands felt wrong, too cold, too heavy. It showed this very spot, the crumbling archway choked with weeds, the same bleached wood, but the Victorian dresses on the figures were threadbare, frayed at the edges, while the automobiles beside them were sleek 1920s models with no license plates, their chrome gleaming dully under a sun that shouldn't have been there. The cars were fun wrong, the dresses fun wrong. Yet the location was etched into my bones. I traced the edge of the photo, the paper gritty under my thumb, and the moths swirling around my head began to spin faster, a tight spiral of ash and shadow. Their wings scraped against each other with a dry, rhythmic click, click-cleash, like brittle bones being tapped together. The low frequency pulsed harder now, vibrating the sand beneath my worn boots. I felt the pull in my teeth, a deep, insistent tug towards the dark maw of the resort's main hall. The damp sand shifted under my feet, clinging like wet clay, resisting my step forward. Yet the pull was undeniable, a gravity well in the silence. I looked down. The moths weren't just swirling. They were forming something. They coalesced into a precise path on the sand, a trail of ash and shadow leading directly towards the broken doorway. The path was unnaturally straight, cutting through the uneven terrain like a knife. The tick of the broken pocket watch I found earlier tucked in my coat, now merged with the moths, clicking, a discordant counterpoint to the crushing silence. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the low thrum. Purposeful drive, I told myself, the only thing keeping me from turning and running back to the empty shore. But the photos anachronisms, Victorian dresses beside silent, plateless cars, were a wound in the fabric of reality. The moths above the path thickened, their wings clicking faster, sharper, for bone on bone. The air grew colder, smelling of ozone and old paper, the scent of the academic library I'd fled. I saw the cat then, a shadow in the periphery of the archway, its fur slick with black tears that vanished before hitting the sand. It didn't move, just watched. Its purr a low vibration I felt in my marrow, amplifying the dread, making the silence feel like a scream. The moths were no longer swirling. They were a single, solid line of ash, clicking as they moved. The path was waiting. The pull was absolute. I took a step, the damp sand sucking at my boot, the thick, click of the moths, and the watch merging into one relentless sound. The resort's darkness yawned open, and the moths coalesced into a single path leading into the resort, their wings clicking like bone on bone. The doorway wasn't an opening so much as a subtraction, a space carved out of the oppressive silence. I stumbled through, the moth dust clinging to my coat like a second skin, tasting bitter on my tongue. The air within was different, 20 heavier, pregnant with the scent of decay and something else, something floral and unsettlingly sweet, like lavender pressed into ancient paper. It was a library, or what remained of one. Towering shelves crafted from a wood so dark it seemed to absorb light, stretched into the gloom, crammed with manuscripts bound in cracked leather and brittle vellum. The smell intensified, a cloying sweetness that made my stomach churn. The low thrum in my skull amplified, resonating with the room's oppressive stillness. It was a physical pressure now, a tightening behind my eyes. I ran a hand along a shelf, the spines of the books crumbling under my touch. Etruscan, Linear B. Languages I'd only glimpsed in dusty academic texts, now staring back at me from the decaying pages. The ink shimmered, an unnatural, oily sheen that seemed to writhe in the dim light. Purposeful drive. The moths followed, a swirling cloud that parted to let me pass, their wings clicking a relentless rhythm against the silence. A cat sat atop a precarious pile of vellum, a black silhouette against the gloom. It was the same cat I'd seen at the archway, its fur slick and damp, its eyes luminous in the shadows. It wept, not a gentle trickle but a steady stream of black tears that dripped onto the ancient text below. The purr, a low, guttural vibration, resonated in my bones, amplifying the dread that clung to the air. It wasn't a comforting sound. It was a tuning fork, vibrating my anxiety into a palpable presence. The cat's gaze locked onto mine, an unsettling intensity in its amber eyes. It didn't flinch, didn't move, just watched 20-watt. The thrum in my skull pulsed, drawing my attention to a small table tucked into a corner. A typewriter, an antique Underwood, its keys yellowed and worn. It sat on the table as if waiting. I approached cautiously, the floorboards groaning beneath my weight. The air around the typewriter felt colder, charged with a static electricity that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. The cat's purr deepened, a low, insistent hum. I reached out, my fingers hovering over the keys. The typewriter began to move, not violently, but with a slow, deliberate certainty. Keys clacked, spitting out a ribbon of paper. Verse, cryptic, unsettling verse. The undertaker walks where clocks unspool. The words appeared on the page in a spidery script, the ink still wet, shimmering with that same oily sheen as the manuscripts on the shelves. I traced the words with my finger, the scent of lavender clinging to the paper, a phantom fragrance in the decay. The low thrum intensified, almost painful now. I glanced at the cat. Its tears flowed faster, leaving dark streaks on its fur, the black droplets glistening in the gloom. The rustling of silk, a whisper in the silence, seemed to emanate from the typewriter itself. It was a sound that shouldn't exist, a texture of sound that felt wrong, like a memory of something I'd never experienced. The verse on the page seemed to shift, the words rearranging themselves in my peripheral vision. Purposeful drive, it felt like a fragile shield against a rising tide of madness. The cat leapt, a sudden, fluid movement that shattered the oppressive stillness. It launched itself from the pile of vellum, landing silently on the floor. Its black tears hit the floor like obsidian raindrops, leaving dark, shimmering pools on the dust-covered stone. The tick-tick of the moth's wings accelerated, a frantic counterpoint to the low thrum. The cat turned and vanished into the shadows, leaving me alone in the suffocating silence of the library, the cryptic verse mocking me from the page. The typewriter's carriage hummed like a trapped insect, its keys gleaming dulled brass beneath the dim glow. I fed it a scrap of paper, torn from the edge of a manuscript whose ink had bled into the fibers. The feed mechanism groaned, a slow, deliberate drag as if reluctant to accept the offering. The keys struck with a futha hock, thuk, thut, fuk, fuk, each letter forming in oily ink that didn't quite dry. Asterisk souls collected where the sea forgets its name. Asterisk the words spread across the page like a stain, the scent of lavender unspooling behind them, thick as syrup in the back of my throat. My fingers trembled, just once before I forced them steady. The second line came next, the typewriter's rhythm unbroken, asterisk the undertaker's coat is woven from twilight. Asterisk the letters curled at the edges as if the paper itself were melting. The air turned viscous. The lavender scent coiled around my skull, pressing against my temples like a bandage soaked in something rotten. My breath hitched. The moths suspended in midair began to flutter in unison. Their wings a chorus of fud-fush, shh, that grated against the silence. The pulsing in my ears sharpened, syncing with the rustling silk. The sound that wasn't a sound, the texture of absence that slithered along my skin. I swallowed hard. The cat's purr had faded, but the vibration lingered in my bones, a low, insistent throb. Then, the shadows moved, not a shift in light, not a flicker of movement from the corners of my eyes. The darkness undetached, peeling away from the walls like wet fabric. Figures emerged, their forms solid yet wrong, men and women in 1920s attire, their suits and dresses stiff as dried husks. Their faces were hollow, the sockets beneath their eyes black and deep as open wounds. They walked toward the cliff, their footsteps silent, their hands clutching at nothing. The pulsing in my ears matched their steps, a slow, deliberate march, like the ticking of a clock counting down to something irreversible. A gasp, choked, wet, ripped through the air. Not from me, from one of the figures. A woman in a frayed silk dress turned her head toward me, her lips parting. No sound came, but the air between us shuddered funded as if something had been torn loose. Asterisk Barnaby. Asterisk Barnaby. Asterisk the whisper slithered into my skull, not through my ears but through the marrow of my bones. Asterisk the end is here. Asterisk the figures stopped, all at once. Their heads snapped toward me in unison, a grotesque, synchronized movement. Their mouths opened. No sound, no breath. Just the slow, wet unpeeling of lips as if they were made of something that could stretch, could forgive. The lavender scent thickened, pressing against my lungs, and for a moment I saw them, ferially saw them. Not as figures, but as what they were, shadows given form, souls collected by the undertaker, their faces frozen in the moment of cessation. The pulsing in my ears became a roar, a physical force pressing against my eardrums. The typewriter clattered to a halt, the last line of verse hanging in the air like a curse. The figures turned in unison. Their mouths moved. No words, no breath. Just the slow, deliberate unraveling of something that had never been alive. The world held its breath. It wasn't a metaphor. The air itself felt suspended, a taut membrane stretched between unseen forces. No wind ruffled the decaying awnings of the resort. No gulls cried overhead, only the hum. It had escalated, burrowed into my skull, a low, insistent throb that resonated with my own pulse. Each beat felt like a hammer blow against the silence. The cat, Silas, moved beside me, his weeping black tears leaving glistening trails on the cracked pavement. They pooled, miniature obsidian mirrors reflecting the warped ochre sky. The streets were wrong. Buildings leaned at angles that defied gravity, their facades peeling like sunburnt skin. The familiar layout of the resort, the grand ballroom, the faded casino, shifted and distorted with each step. It was as if the very architecture was struggling to maintain its form, a fever dream rendered in burnt sienna and faded ochre. Silas, Esper. Usually a comforting rumble felt strained, a mechanical vibration fighting against the oppressive quiet. It amplified the pulsing in my ears, making it almost unbearable. The sea. It called to me, not with a sound, but with a feeling, a relentless tugging, a silent invitation. The waves crashed against the shore in perfect synchronicity with my heartbeat, a morbid metronome, marking the passage of something irreversible. The sand squelched beneath my boots, a wet, unsettling sound in the absolute stillness. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the very ground were resisting my progress. I glanced at Silas. His tears flowed freely now, dark rivers tracing paths down his fur. He seemed to sense the pull too, his body rigid, his tail twitching nervously. Ahead, the cliff edge, and on it, them. The figures, they moved with a disconcerting grace, their steps silent, their forms indistinct in the fading light. They were walking toward the water, not stumbling, not hesitating, but moving with a purpose that chilled me to the bone. Men and women in the drab, muted colors of the 1920s, suits and dresses that clung to their forms like shrouds. I couldn't make out their faces, only the sense of hollow emptiness where eyes should be. The lavender scent, that sickly sweet miasma, returned. It clung to the back of my throat, a phantom taste of decay. My hands trembled, not from cold, but from a primal fear that resonated deep within my bones. I tried to look away, to break the connection, but my gaze was locked, drawn to the silent procession. They were waiting for something. Or someone. I felt a tightening in my chest, a pressure building behind my ribs. The pulsing intensified, vibrating through my very being. The world seemed to flicker, the edges of my vision blurring. A sense of unreality pressed in, a certainty that this wasn't real, that I was trapped in some grotesque, distorted simulation. The repeating patterns of the buildings, the synchronized movements of the figures, the relentless rhythm of the waves. It was all too perfect, too precise. Silas suddenly darted forward, a black blur against the ochre landscape. He moved with an urgency I hadn't seen before, his tail a frantic whip. He headed straight for the cliff edge toward the silent figures. The cat Esper surged, no longer a comforting rumble, but a high-pitched whine that pierced the silence, a desperate plea or a warning. It resonated with the pulsing, amplifying it to an almost unbearable level. I started to move after him, a desperate need to pull him back, to escape this suffocating reality. But my feet felt rooted to the ground, trapped in the squelching, wet sand. Silas reached the edge and vanished. The sand clung to my boots, a viscous embrace. Silas was gone, vanished over the edge. The silence pressed down, a physical weight. It wasn't the absence of sound precisely, but the wrongness of it. The world held its breath, and I felt like I was drowning in the stillness. The pulsing hammered in my skull, a frantic drumbeat against the backdrop of nothing. Each throb resonated with the lavender scent, that sickly sweetness coating my tongue. Then, a shift, not in the landscape, not in the figures still moving towards the water, but in the air itself. A ripple, like heat rising from asphalt on a summer day, but colder, much colder. From within that distortion he emerged. He wasn't tall, not imposing in stature, but the way the light bent around him, the way the ochre sky seemed to find partout for his passage. That was unsettling. His coat was a study in shadows, not a solid black, but a swirling, shifting darkness that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. It moved with a disconcerting fluidity, as if the fabric itself were liquid. A faint twilight rustling emanated from it, like silk whispering secrets I couldn't comprehend. "Your time is spent, Barnaby," he murmured. The voice wasn't loud, but it resonated within my skull, bypassing my ears entirely. It felt internal, like a thought planted directly into my mind. I tried to speak, to scream, but my throat constricted, a vice clamping down on my vocal cords. The pulsing intensified, a searing pain behind my eyes. Flashes. Images assaulted me, brief, chaotic glimpses of lives extinguished. A woman's face contorted in terror as she slipped beneath the waves. A man's hand clutching at the air as he collapsed onto the ballroom floor. A child's laughter abruptly cut short. Each image was accompanied by a whisper, a chorus of voices, all murmuring the same phrase, "Thank you." It wasn't malicious, not overtly threatening, but profoundly unsettling, a gratitude born of release. My hands trembled, not from cold, but from a visceral dread that paralyzed my limbs. I wanted to look away, to run, to claw my way back to whatever semblance of reality I could remember. But I was rooted to the spot, trapped by an invisible force. The undertaker's hand extended. It wasn't a gesture of aggression, but of completion. The glove was made of something that resembled night itself, a viscous, swirling darkness that seemed to absorb all light. It pulsed with the same rhythm as the throbbing in my head. The lavender scent intensified, choking me. I tasted decay, a phantom bitterness on my tongue. The figures on the cliff edge seemed to coalesce, their forms sharpening, their faces still blank, but radiating an almost palpable sense of anticipation. The synchronized movements of their steps became more pronounced, a macabre dance performed for an unseen audience. The waves crashed against the shore, each impact echoing the frantic beat of my heart. I felt a tightening in my chest, a pressure building behind my ribs. The world began to fray at the edges, the meticulously crafted illusion of the resort cracking like ancient porcelain. The repeating patterns of the buildings stuttered, the angles shifting subtly, then snapping back into place. The sky flickered, the ochre hue deepening, then lightening, as if struggling to maintain its color. The pulsing reached a crescendo, a blinding wave of sensation that threatened to shatter my mind. It was as if the very fabric of reality was unraveling, revealing the chaotic void beneath. I saw Silas then, a fleeting glimpse of his black form disappearing into the swirling shadows of the undertaker's coat, a desperate, silent plea in his weeping eyes. The undertaker's fingers brushed my wrist, a touch as cold as the grave, and then the world twin-shattered. Not with a bang, but with a sickening swing-shatter, like 1,000 porcelain teacups dropped onto a stone floor. A street lamp, previously casting a sickly yellow glow, flickered violently, then reversed its motion, retracting backward into its pole, the light vanishing as if it had never been. No more suffering, no more you. The words weren't spoken, not in the conventional sense. They bloomed within my skull, cold and invasive, like frost spreading across a window pane. My vision swam, the ochre sky blurring into a sickly swirl. I stumbled, the sand beneath my boots suddenly yielding, as if it were quicksand. A glimpse of a fractured reflection fuckened, in a puddle nearby. It was me undeniably, yet wrong. The edges of my face softened, the lines of my jaw dissolving into the murky water. It wasn't a reflection of Tumby Meeby as I was, but a projection of what I was someday becoming. The lavender scent intensified, no longer a sickly sweetness, but a metallic tang, like old blood and decaying flowers. It coated my tongue, a bitter film that clung to the back of my throat. The pulsing in my head escalated, a relentless hammering that resonated with the rhythmic drip, drip, drip of something falling onto bone. I didn't need to look to know it was the cat. The creature, a perpetual fountain of black tears, had positioned itself at my feet. Each drop struck the sand with a tiny, mournful funplinky. The figures on the cliff edge moved closer, their blank faces radiating an unsettling stillness. They weren't walking precisely but gliding, their feet barely disturbing the sand. The synchronized movements were hypnotic, a macabre ballet performed for an unseen audience. A low hum began to permeate the air, a subsonic thrum that vibrated in my teeth, amplifying the pulsing in my head. The undertaker's hand remained extended, the glove a vortex of shadow. I tried to pull away, to claw my way back to some semblance of coherence, but my limbs felt heavy, leaden. The cat's purr, a low rumble that had previously been a background drone, intensified, becoming a physical force. It pressed against my chest, a suffocating weight that stole my breath. The world warped around me, the meticulously crafted illusion of the resort fracturing. A building across the way momentarily duplicated itself, a ghostly echo superimposed over the original. Then, just as quickly, it vanished. Fu no more you. The thought resonated again, colder this time, laced with an unsettling finality. I felt my bones softening, the structure of my skeleton becoming fluid, my fingers elongated, the skin stretching and thinning. I could feel the marrow within them liquefying, a disconcerting sloshing sensation. My vision frayed at the edges, the periphery dissolving into a hazy gray. The figures on the cliff seemed to merge, their forms coalescing into a single, monolithic entity. Silas. I remembered Silas, his desperate plea in his eyes as he vanished into the undertaker's coat. A flicker of hope quickly extinguished. Was this what awaited me? Absorption? Dissolution? The thought was less terrifying than the utter emptiness that accompanied it. The absence of self. My hand, the one the undertaker's glove was about to touch, began to fade. Not a sudden disappearance, but a gradual erasure, as if the colors were being leached from a photograph. The skin became translucent, the veins beneath visible as a network of dark blue lines. The sand beneath my hand seemed to ripple, distorting the image of the cliff edge. The lavender scent became overwhelming, a suffocating blanket that pressed down on me. The cat's purr rose to a fever pitch, a vibrating hum that resonated with the fracturing of my being. The drip-drip of the black tears accelerated, a mournful counterpoint to the escalating chaos. A final thought, fleeting and fragile: find is beautiful. The unraveling wasn't painful, not precisely. It was a release, a surrender. And then nothing. The impulse was immediate, visceral. A rejection of the encroaching dissolution. I ran. Not towards anything but Taventu away. The sand, still yielding beneath my boots, tugged at my heels, a desperate attempt to tether me to the crumbling reality. The lavender scent, once a suffocating blanket, now felt like a physical force pushing me forward the town. It wasn't right. Buildings, once solid structures of faded grandeur, began to melt like wax under a malevolent sun. The ornate facade of the confectionery warped, the gingerbread figures dissolving into grotesque, elongated shapes. A street I just traversed looped back on itself, a sickening midbia strip of decaying brick and cracked pavement. The burnt sienna of the buildings bled into the faded ochre of the sky, the colors swirling together in a nauseating vortex. My own reflection in a shop window stopped me dead. It wasn't the face I recognized. Older, certainly. The youthful lines softened, replaced by a network of deep, etched wrinkles. The eyes, once filled with a desperate hope, were bloodshot and vacant, glazed with a sickly film. A trickle of crimson snaked down from the corner of his mouth, staining the faded collar of his coat. It was me, undeniably, yet a corrupted echo. A glimpse into a potential future, a horrifying possibility. The image shimmered, fractured, then vanished as I blinked, leaving only the distorted reflection of the looping street. The pulsing intensified, a low, guttural thrum that resonated not just in my ears, but in my bones. It layered itself with something else descend. A chorus of distant screams, thin and reedy, carried on a wind that didn't seem to exist. The cat, a black shadow gliding just ahead, emitted a mournful fumu sound, a sound that seemed to amplify the surrounding dread. Each step I took felt like wading through treacle, the resistance growing with every meter. The cat led me, unerringly, back towards the library. I didn't want to go back. The thought was a silent scream trapped within my skull, but the compulsion was stronger, an invisible tether pulling me towards the epicenter of this distortion. The air thickened, the lavender scent becoming almost unbearable, pressing against my lungs. The library doors, once imposing and grand, now hung askew, the wood warped and splintered. Inside, the familiar scent of aged paper and leather was tainted with a metallic tang, a coppery undertone that clung to the back of my throat. Dust motes danced in the fractured light filtering through the grimy windows, each particle a tiny shimmering specter. The pulsing was deafening now, a physical assault on my senses. I stumbled towards the typewriter, the object of my desperate hope. The keys were coated in a layer of grime, the ribbon faded and brittle. I braced myself, expecting a message, a clue, tween something. The machine whirred, a mechanical groan that echoed through the silent room. The carriage returned and a line of text appeared on the page. You are the flaw. The words were stark, brutal, devoid of any nuance. They weren't a prophecy, but an accusation. A condemnation. The floor beneath me seemed to tilt, the walls closing in. The burnt sienna and faded ochre hues intensified, swallowing the room in a suffocating gloom. I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me, the world blurring at the edges. The cat's purr, a low rumble that had always been present, intensified, vibrating in my chest like a trapped insect. A crackle like a film reel skipping filled the air. The library's door slammed shut with a resounding funboom. The sound echoed, distorted, then abruptly ceased. I turned, expecting to see the familiar hallway, the rows of towering bookshelves. But it wasn't there. Instead, a hallway stretched before me, impossibly long, receding into an infinite darkness. No walls, no ceiling, just a corridor that seemed to defy the very laws of perspective. It wasn't a hallway but a void, a gaping maw leading into the unknown. The lavender scent was overwhelming, a final, suffocating wave. The pulsing peaked, then abruptly cut out, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. The puddle was viscous, black, reflecting not my face, but a fractured mosaic of them, each a silent scream trapped behind glass. My mother's disappointment, a familiar ache in my gut, superimposed itself over the distorted image. Then another a younger Barnaby, defiant, hopeful. Then another, older, ravaged by something I couldn't yet name. The cat, a constant shadow at my heels, wept into the oily surface, the black tears merging with the reflections, blurring the already grotesque tableau. Its purr resonated within my chest, not a comfort, but a vibrational assault, amplifying the panic clawing at my throat. A low, guttural hum, rising in pitch, threatening to shatter the fragile remnants of my sanity. I tried to run, a desperate, instinctive flail against the encroaching wrongness. But the library wasn't solid. The walls fin-shifted. The ornate bookshelves, once comforting anchors in a sea of knowledge, warped and contorted, their spines blurring into a chaotic jumble of faded titles. The floor beneath me tilted, becoming a wall, then a ceiling, then a floor again. Each transition a sickening lurch, a betrayal of gravity and reason. The air thickened, heavy with the lavender scent, now laced with a metallic tang that tasted like fear. The rustling silk. It wasn't fabric, not exactly. It was a sound, a pervasive whisper that burrowed into my skull, drowning out all other thought. It coiled around my senses, a suffocating blanket of auditory dread. It felt internal, as if the sound was originating not from the room, but from within my own mind. Shh, shh, shh. It seemed to murmur, a lullaby of madness. My hand scraped against something rough, something that shouldn't be there. A book, yes, but its cover wasn't leather or cloth. It was bone. A brittle, yellowed bone covered in faded script I couldn't decipher. I recoiled, the image searing itself onto my memory. The pulsing intensified, a throbbing pressure behind my eyes, blurring the already distorted reality. The faces in the puddle multiplied, each one a variation on a theme of despair. I stumbled, catching myself on a desk that wasn't there a moment before. Its surface was slick, coated in a viscous residue that clung to my fingers. I tried to wipe it off, but the residue only spread, staining my skin with a sickly yellow hue. The cat emitted a low, mournful timew, a sound that seemed to amplify the surrounding chaos. The room was shrinking, the walls closing in, the ceiling pressing down on me like a physical weight. The typewriter sat on a table that had materialized from the shifting chaos. The keys were coated in that same viscous residue, the faded ribbon a tangled mess. I stared at it, a desperate plea forming in my throat. A message, a clue, anything to anchor me to some semblance of reality. I reached for it, my hand trembling. Then I saw it. My reflection in the polished surface of the typewriter. Not just my reflection, but two reflections. Multiple Barnabys, each frozen in a moment of panicked escape. One reaching for the typewriter, another falling to his knees, another screaming silently into the void. They were repeating the same actions over and over again, a loop of terror playing out before my eyes. The cat's purr peaked, a deafening crescendo that resonated through my bones. The reflections began to move in sync with my own movements. My arm reached for the typewriter. The reflection's arms reached for the typewriter. My foot stumbled. The reflection's feet stumbled. I was trapped in a grotesque pantomime, a puppet in a play directed by madness. The room twisted again, the walls dissolving into a swirling vortex of burnt sienna and faded ochre. The lavender scent became overwhelming, choking me. The rustling silk intensified, a deafening roar in my ears. The pulsing reached a fever pitch, then abruptly ceased, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. My own reflection, frozen mid-gesture, began to repeat the escape attempt. The walls exhaled, a wet, rattling gasp, like a drowned man surfacing from the ocean floor, sent a cascade of peeling wallpaper spiraling at my feet. The fibers curled into skeletal fingers, clawing at the air before dissolving into ash. My breath hitched. The resort wasn't decaying. It was sous vide unraveling, thread by thread, as if someone had reached inside and begun to pluck it apart. The ochre walls bled through the cracks, a thick, greasy stain creeping outward like a wound. The floorboards groaned beneath me, not from weight, but from the absence of it. Hollow, waiting. The train whistle's civvy wail slithered through the gaps in reality, a sound that wasn't sound but pressure, vibrating in my teeth and the back of my throat. The cat's purr was a blade against my eardrums, each vibration a stab deeper into the marrow of my bones. Its black tears plopped onto the warped hardwood, hissing where they landed, the droplets spreading into oily puddles that mirrored nothing. I stumbled forward, my boot catching on something solid. Then nothing. The desk I'd brushed against a second ago was now a gaping hole, a void yawned open like a mouth, and for a heartbeat I saw Sufin, my mother, younger, standing in the doorway of this very room, her face split between relief and something worse, something that made her lips peel back from her teeth. Then the vision snapped shut, leaving only the stench of salt and rust. A door slammed somewhere in the distance, not once, but 3 times in rapid succession, the sound echoing through the resort like a gunshot. My hands trembled as I pressed them against the wall, only to find it wasn't wallpaper at all, but skin. Human skin stretched thin over bone, the texture slick with something dark and viscous. I recoiled, my fingers leaving streaks of yellowish residue, like the resort itself was bleeding through my touch. The pulsing in my skull intensified, a throb that matched the rhythm of my own heartbeat, only foot wrong, out of sync, like a metronome set to decay. The hallway stretched before me, but it wasn't straight. It breathing, expanding, contracting, the walls undulating like a living thing. I forced my legs forward, each step sending cracks spiderwebbing through the floor beneath me. The cat padded ahead, its tail flicking in agitation, the weeping from its eyes now a steady stream, soaking into the wood. The air thickened, pressing against my skin, and I could feel it, the unseen point. A black hole at the end of the corridor, pulling me like a current. The wail of the train whistle coiled around me, drowning out everything else, until the only thing I could hear was the wet thing slap of my own pulse in my ears. Then I saw them. The doors lining the hallway were open, each one revealing a version of myself, trapped, screaming silently. Their mouths moved in unison, lips stretched too wide, too many teeth. Their voices a chorus of soundless agony. I reached for the first door, my fingers brushing the frame, only to find it wasn't wood, but Teflestion. The reflections inside didn't react. They didn't even look at me. They were all focused on the same thing, Pai Mai. Their arms extended in slow motion, fingers splaying, nails blackened and brittle, scraping against the glass of their prisons. The cat let out a choked, guttural fin yowl, its body arching as if struck. The sound was wrong, too many voices layered into one, overlapping, repeating. The reflections inside the doors took a step forward, their movements synchronized, their mouths parting in identical, silent shrieks. The air pressed against my chest, squeezing, and I realized with a sickening lurch that I was no longer walking toward them. I was falling, pulled by that unseen point at the end of the hall, the one that had been calling to me since the moment I stepped into this rotting shell of a resort. The first reflection's hand broke through the door's surface, fingers wrapping around my wrist with a wet, sucking sound. I twisted, but its grip was iron, cold and unyielding. The others followed, their hands emerging from the doors one by one, reaching, pulling, their silent screams vibrating through the corridor like a physical force. The cat's weeping intensified, its purr now a shriek of its own, and I knew too move. If I didn't move, if I didn't run, I would be dragged into that hallway of doors, swallowed by my own endless, screaming self. The pulsing in my skull reached a crescendo, a single deafening feu de d'air that split the air. The reflections lunged as one, their mouths opening in unison, their hands closing around me. And then the world went still. The hallway was empty. The doors were shut. The only sound was the footwail of the train whistle, now distant, fading, as if the resort itself had decided to swallow it whole. My breath came in ragged gasps, my fingers trembling where they clutched the air. The cat was gone. No weeping, no purr, no shadow at my heels. Just silence. And then a door creaked open behind me. The library void breathed burnt sienna, not a color, but the absence of color, the taste of ash on my tongue. The typewriter lay cold, its keys dull as dead teeth. The cat's tears pooled at my feet, a slick black mirror reflecting not the room, but 20 me, my face dissolving at the edges, skin thinning like old parchment. The undertaker stood where the shelves should have been, a silhouette in the ochre gloom, his voice a dry rustle of silk against bone. "You were never meant to be found." The words didn't echo, they settled into my marrow, colder than the void. My skin began to peel. Not like paper, but like wallpaper unraveling at the seams. A slow, wet shock as the first layer lifted from my forearm. I watched it curl, revealing not flesh, but the same burnt sienna void beneath, a blankness that would pull us in. The sensation wasn't pain, but the absence of it, like stepping into a room with no floor. My fingers trembled as I pressed them against the spot where skin had been. Only the void answered, a sucking cold that made my teeth chatter. The cat's tears rippled in the pool, distorting my fading reflection. I saw my eyes widen, the pupils swallowing the black, my lips parting in a silent scream the void had already stolen. The undertaker shifted. A single rustle, like silk dragging over stone, then nothing. The sound was the only thing left in the universe. The cat's weeping ceased abruptly, its black tears freezing mid-drop in the pool. The pool itself began to drink in me, not water, but the absence of me. My reflection in the tears flickered, my body now translucent, the void visible through my ribs, a yawning emptiness where my heart should have been. The undertaker's voice was gone. Only the rustling silk remained, a sound so soft it was barely a thought, a feather falling through nothingness. I felt the peeling accelerate. My neck, my cheek each layer lifting with a sound like dry leaves skittering over glass. Shick, shick, shick. The void beneath felt like home, like the space I'd been fleeing since I left the city, since I took the train. The cat's form blurred at the edges, its black tears now just dark stains on the void. It didn't vanish into the pool, it flowed into it, a shadow dissolving into ink. Its last sound was a whisper of silk, a sigh that wasn't sound but the absence of sound. My hand reached out, not toward the pool, but into it. The black tears swallowed my fingers, cold and thick as oil. The skin peeled back entirely, revealing the void beneath, the same void that had been pulling me since the hallway of doors. I felt no shock, only a terrible quietness and jay. The nothingness wasn't empty, it was full of all the Barnabys who'd never been found. The pool reflected my hand dissolving, the fingers becoming liquid shadow, the wrist vanishing into the dark. The cat's shadow vanished with it, leaving only the pool's surface, now perfectly still, reflecting nothing. The rustling silk faded into absolute silence. The last thing I heard was the soft, final toy rustle of a single feather dissolving into the void.